Okay, good evening, everybody. It's 7 o'clock. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Spring 2024 Ridgewood High School Guidance Department's College Speaker Series. My name is Dave Bailey. I'm the Assistant Principal and Director of Guidance at Ridgewood High School. We also have helping me tonight Christine Salerno, who's a school counselor at Ridgewood High School, and Laura Loria, who is another one of our school counselors at the high school. They're going to help me tonight, and we're very fortunate and thankful to have in 3 different college representatives this evening come to visit us. One of our goals this year has been to educate our community as much as possible on the college admissions process, and one of the best ways to do that is to bring in experts who are doing this every single day on the other side of the aisle. We're working with high school kids each day in our building, and you are taking high school kids and looking at applications and then bringing them into your college. So it's great for you to be here tonight. We're really thankful that you're taking the time to be here and that you're going to be able to educate our parents and students. This will be recorded. We will send it out tomorrow to the community. It'll be on our website, on our YouTube page. So, everybody will have access to it. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guests today, and again, thank them for being here. We have Trevor O'Brien from Sacred Heart University. We have Danielle Toglia from San Diego State University. And we have Lowell Tillett from Wake Forest University. So thank you all 3 for being here tonight. Again, really, really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to your expertise. So let's get right into it. We'll start with Trevor, and whoever wants to jump in, by all means, go ahead. But as the class of 2024 admission cycle draws to a close, Trevor, could you share 1 or 2 things that stand out this year compared to previous years?
Sure. And good evening to everybody. So happy to be a part of this panel this evening. So I think one thing that certainly stood out to me, not only with the areas that I recruit, but just sort of from our admissions office as a whole, was the amount of engagement that the students had. Again, that's something that we do track and we do look at very closely at Sacred Heart. And we certainly saw an uptick in students that had that engagement. And what do I mean by that? Well, it happens in a few different ways. One of which is engaging when colleges and universities come to your school. I was at Ridgewood this fall for a visit, and I had about 20 students, which was excellent. At the college fair as well, several students were coming up to our table and asking questions. Certainly, there were a lot of students that visited our campus, did interviews with our admissions staff. And I think that's really important. You want to get to know the colleges that you're applying to as much as possible. And I certainly think that that engagement piece is so very important, because there are a lot of things that you can learn from our admissions staffs when you're engaging with us, again, either when we visit you or when you visit us. So I think that was something very critical. And something else that I sort of noticed too, that a lot of students had, at least again, from my perspective, students that I were working with had smaller lists of schools. And I'm not entirely sure what the reason for that may have been. I think that's something that we'll certainly look at a bit more this summer. But a lot of students that I had talked to really had lists of only 5 or 6 different colleges. There was still a diverse group. There were some students that were looking in the Northeast, down South, West Coast, Midwest, even within that 5, 6, 7 school range. So I thought that was interesting. Sometimes students will have 12, 15, 20 schools on their list, which isn't a bad thing. But I think having the smaller lists maybe allows you to have more of that engagement with the colleges that you're looking at.
Yeah, I agree, Trevor. I think that the diversity of lists this year was quite unique. Perhaps being at a fairly new institution for myself and looking at students and working with them in terms of their list, comparing and contrasting. I felt like the lists were growing in terms of, geographic diversity, financial obligation, size, shape, scope. I think students are doing a really good job of really finding the right fits for themselves, most importantly. And sometimes when we look at the list, right, from the admission perspective, we think it looks a little unique and odd. But I think, from the student perspective, it could be based on major, It could be based on interest, a club or activity, perhaps that's really essential to their, their future. So I think the lists were really unique and diverse this year, which is always nice to see, especially geographic diversity for those of us that are not in the area. And obviously, as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit in terms of the competitiveness of the admission process, nice to see that there's a large scope of schools, I think, that students are looking at. I also found that students are doing a good job of looking early. Maybe not rushing through the search so much to get to the application process, but really taking their time more so in the search. I always find that juniors are rushing their process because they're anxious about what to write for the essay, or perhaps who they're asking for a letter of recommendation for. So they don't pay as much mind to perhaps creating a list that's really appropriate, right? The more appropriate the list, the better the outcome in terms of the decision making. And I found this year that students might be slowing down a little bit, taking a deep breath, hopefully utilizing their counselors, in their offices, and creating a list that's really, again, appropriate for themselves. And so maybe that's why the list does look a little unique from our side of the desk. And I hope for them, it's really finding those right fits. So maybe narrowing down their choices a little bit early, maybe seeing less applications overall, which is, I think, an okay thing, right? Over applying is one of my no-nos. And if you really do your search appropriately and you find those great fits, there's really no reason to over apply.
I guess what I would just chime in, I think the big overarching thing that admissions has had to deal with this year is the FAFSA and the cloud hanging over the FAFSA. And so I think that students and families, almost by necessity, have probably been forced to do more independent research on what financial aid is going to look like, the cost and finances affiliated with schools. And I think that may be playing a part in terms of kind of the selectivity, right? Because you're having to really just a bare minimum get to know, okay, can I actually afford this school in order to be able to kind of consider it? And that requires you to do that deep digging, to get to know the school better, to have that engagement with the school, to rely on counselors more. I think as well, you have a great set of resources, and I do recommend using them. But I think that a big part of that is in terms of being able to walk through the complications that have arisen from things like the FAFSA this year.
Great. And before we get to the next question, parents, if you have questions throughout, you can enter them in the chat and we'll get to them as many as we can at the end of our questions. Hopefully most of them are answered, but if not, feel free to write in the chat and we will get to them at the end.
Great. Thank you so much for all of that. So we do understand that the letters of recommendation are a pretty significant part of the student's application overall. So when reading teacher letters, what aspects are most important to you? Do you have tips for students as they are now beginning to start to ask for letters? Do you have tips for them about who they should consider asking, and who do you want to hear from? How many letters do you want to read? What are you hoping that message, what message do you hope gets across in those letters?
I can certainly just mention something just quickly here with that. I don't think the volume of letter is, for us at least, too much of an issue, right? We have some students that will only have their school counselor send them a letter. We've had, in some cases, 4 or 5 letters come in for a student, which is, again, not necessarily a bad thing either. I think the biggest thing when you're identifying those people that you want to write recommendation letters for you are the ones that you have, close ties with, right? So whether that is a coach, perhaps a teacher that you really value, maybe you've had them for a few different times. I have had, though, a lot of recommendations that sort of come from outside of school. I do like those ones very much. Again, it could be from a local community partner. Perhaps you do a lot of community service and, your boss at that site want you to write a recommendation for you. Or if, again, there's someone else external from your school area that you would write a recommendation for. I do seem to like those ones a bit more because it provides, I guess, a different perspective than just the student, right? Because a lot of the times those external letters of recommendation, the person knows the student more as a person, right? And outside of school. So I do like those ones a bit, I will say.
So I'll go ahead and chime in here really quickly. I think most schools are going to require either 0, 1, or 2 teacher recommendations, with the preference pretty strongly being towards a core subject junior year teacher. I think that's pretty standard across the board. But I do think that it's really important. Every school kind of handles, so this is going to be a general disclaimer for everything that we talk about tonight. Every school handles things differently. And every school has kind of different processes. And so if you're applying to, say, San Diego State and Sacred Heart and Wake Forest, like these are 3 very different admissions offices. We have very different review practices. And so you need to figure out what the school actually is requiring versus what is encouraged versus what would be a no-no, right? I'm amused. I was laughing. Trevor said he's received 4 or 5. I've gotten up to 20 letters of recommendation before. And I will read every single one of them, but I may not be in the best mood at the end of it. And so my usual recommendation for students, I think it is okay to submit extra letters of recommendation if they're going to be additive to an application. I do not necessarily need to read 3 different teacher recommendations from math teachers who all are going to say the student is good at math. I am not getting a lot of additional information after that first one. However, if there are different parts of your life that you think are encapsulated by different people who can write you those letters, then by all means, I think that is very helpful to us. And I think that that's when you should consider adding kind of those extra and maybe reaching out to additional recommenders.
Although we don't require letters at SDSU, given my previous years in higher education, I would recommend too that as the student, if you obviously are looking to secure a letter of recommendation from a teacher, as well as from your counselor, right, you ask early. So be sure that you're giving enough time and respect to the faculty member who's writing the letter to put together a strong letter of recommendation for you and be able to advocate for you and send it in a timely fashion so that it can be added to your file. Maybe a nice resume or some kind of a chart, a grid, a graph, that you might include to say, listen, this is something I want to share, and perhaps you can do it with me. In terms of the letter of recommendation is also something I think that's a nice additive so that they can pull information from different aspects of your life and include it in their letter. But I would want to ask early and ask for a glowing letter of recommendation, from your faculty member early in the time frame so that you allow them enough time to prepare.
Lowell, I think 20 is the new record that I've heard an admissions rep receive. So I hope you took a walk after reading that file. Next question. So in addition to a campus visit, sending an email, what else can rising seniors do to show that they're interested? How can they learn more about a college, specifically in showing that they're interested in this idea of demonstrated interest? What are some tips?
Yeah, so I think that whether a student is looking at institutions that check a box and say, we're looking specifically at demonstrated interest, right, Laura, it's always the opportunity for the student to start to do their research and get to know that university, right? It's like a marriage, you're leading up to the proposal, right? And checking boxes, of course, is one thing in terms of demonstrated interest and the need for institutions to look at that. But I think overall, we want to be sure that it's the right fit for the student if they're going to ultimately apply to that institution. So maybe it starts with the visit to the high school and meeting the representative that might ultimately sit with your application. But I think it goes well above and beyond that. The tour of the campus can be the culmination, right, of the check the box, I'm applying, it's the right fit for me. But in between, there can be so many numerous conversations with students on our campuses, whether that's virtual or in person, maybe a formalized panel or something where you pick up the phone and say, hey, Danielle, my interest is business at San Diego State. Can you, introduce me to a student who I might be able to have a conversation with? Maybe it moves further to actually a faculty conversation where you talk a little bit more about the courses that we offer, the advising that we can offer you, career services, where you might be able to delve into an internship and put your academic resources, into play outside of the classroom. Maybe that continues into your own neighborhood with an alumni that might live locally that you might sit with, formal or informal interview, where you get to talk a little bit about, again, their experience at our institutions. That could obviously continue right throughout the process to admitted student programming and overnight stays, maybe for an athlete meeting the team, that they might ultimately join on a college campus, or perhaps, trying out for something like an audition that might occur for an art student. So I think there's a lot of touch points that can happen, over your high school career to each university that you have interest in. But maybe try not to think of it as so much demonstrated interest, but your ability to sort of filter information, to do your research appropriately, to find a great fit for yourself, and do it now, right? Sometimes if you're lending, you think that the time that you have will lend itself to an appropriate, time frame and search later. It is really, really crunch time if you're waiting to receive a decision, right? If you're waiting until April, let's say 1st to receive a decision, and even with a May 1st deadline, it's difficult to get to places to visit and to push everything into one, month when you're ultimately making a decision, if you have not stepped onto the campus already. So I would say visit, visit, visit small, medium, large, urban, suburban, rural, close to home, far away. Think about that as, again, ways in which you can narrow down your interest and focus on the things that are important to you.
I think Danielle, I might take that from you. I like that. That was like perfect. It encapsulated pretty much everything. So, I mean, nothing much really that I would need to add. One thing I will say is you would be surprised at the opportunities that a lot of universities do have in terms of that demonstrated interest, or just in terms of that engagement possibility. For example, there are many universities that will do regional interviews, right? I had regional interviews with several seniors from Ridgewood High School this year when I was traveling in Bergen County, and a lot of universities will offer that. And so that's a great way for us to get to know you again, more than just reading your application, And so there are so many little nuanced pieces, like Danielle had mentioned, through the process that you can find with a school. And it is more than, like you had said, just going and walking through the campus. I will say that is a major indicator and a great way for you to get a sense as to whether or not the campus is a fit for you. But my gosh, there is so much that you can do, especially earlier on, as she had said, in the process. So taking full advantage now. You're all doing it here in the session with us tonight. Great place to start, and certainly continue that momentum, over the next few months and into the fall time.
I will say, just to add one thing, and we talked about things that we've noticed from last year to this year. If you are looking at a school, and I would urge you, if you are looking at a school that is looking at demonstrated interest and tracking demonstrated interest, I'm finding less and less students will fill out an inquiry card, will visit our mailing list and add themselves, etc. So I would encourage you that if you are looking at an institution that is looking at demonstrated interest, you continually ask about filling that card out or going to the mailing list online, so that the school is aware that you are aware of them. So, just take some mental notes about schools that might be looking at the demonstrated interest factor and checking that box. Because if you are on the campus visiting, you want to check in. If you are at your high school and you can remove yourself from class, you're not missing too much information, you can come and say hello. And if you are missing information and you can't miss class, you can drop us a note, stop by, ask your counselor to leave information for us with your name. We'd be more than happy to reach out, at another time.
I'll just piggyback off that really, really quickly. At the risk of being the worst college representative ever, make a burner email account or two, because we will absolutely bombard you with emails. My recommendation, so pro tip, make a bunch of burners, but have the name of the school in the name. So Lowell, Tillett, Wake Forest, Lowell, Tillett, Sacred Heart, Lowell, Tillett, SDSU @gmail.com or something like that. And then just give it to the one school. And that way all of your mail is sorted for you. And once you decide you can cross that school off your list, you can just not answer that email anymore. Easy peasy.
That's a good one. I've never heard of that. And sort it for yourself. So we often hear students and parents, they ask kind of how students should maybe spend their summer or additional free time, or how they can kind of add maybe to their resume, or like what is your advice from your end on those things that come up, and what students should be doing during the summer and free time?
So this is a question that I think about a lot, because I think that young people these days feel extraordinarily pressured to be perfect. And it is actually kind of ridiculous. Unless you are really, really trying to get into a Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford kind of school, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have cured cancer or climbed Mount Everest over your summer vacation. I think most schools are just genuinely interested in trying to get to know you based on who you are. And every single student is different. There's not like one surefire answer to this, because everyone will have different interests and different hobbies and different passions and things that they want to explore more. I think the general idea that schools want to see is you following up on those. And I do think that it's easy to, point to academic kind of merits and things like that. And oh, I did this and this in program. Those are great. Schools will offer them. Wake Forest offers them. They're great. They're maybe not the bellwether that I think some people think they are in terms of kind of a helpful part of the process, but they do genuinely show that this is a student who's making an effort to push themselves academically and engage in an academic activity over summer. So there's no one right answer to that question, I don't think. It's entirely student by student, but just follow your passions. Do the things that matter to you and see where they take you. And that's, I think, what colleges are really interested in kind of getting to learn about.
I'm glad you said that about the sorry, Christine. I'm glad you said that, Lowell, about like the perfectionist piece, because we're seeing that more and more with our kids and our teenagers. And I think also like a fear of making mistakes, or a fear of, not being perfect, which none of us are. So I think I see that in younger people now. I've been at Ridgewood High School since 2010, so you just notice different patterns, but I've seen that. And our message, and I want to make sure it aligns with what you kind of see at the college and what you want in your young people coming to your schools is, truly do things you're passionate in. And even if it's one or two things that you're fully committed to and that you enjoy and that you've, done over the course of your high school career, that's enough. That is enough. You don't have to add 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things just because you think it might look good to, the three of you on this call. If you're not interested in it, or you're doing it for the wrong reasons, or there's too much going on in a young person's life to not go after and do the things and concentrate on the things they're passionate about. So that's what our counselors really try to preach with our kids. But I'm glad you brought that up, Lowell. We're seeing that on our end as well with the perfectionism and the kind of the race to nowhere thing of, you can always compare yourself to somebody else. So thank you for saying that. I don't know if anyone else has any comment on that.
I was just going to say, we know that one thing is not going to make or break an application, right? It's not one thing that an admission council looks at and says, wow, that student did this one thing for 2 months in their entire 18 years, and that's why we're going to admit them to our institution, right? That generally doesn't happen. And so I think in that respect, right, we have a summer break to have a break. We have a summer break so you can read a great book that you want to and not that you have to. We have a summer break so you can travel with your family that you really don't get to spend much time with during the week because you're running to an athletic event. We have summer break because you might want to volunteer because you really want to. And it's not a resume builder, but it's an opportunity for you to spend time with a certain group of people. I think summer breaks are necessary. I wish I had one. But I think, in essence, the summer break, can be a great way for you to get ahead academically, for you to catch up academically. But I think it really is also not a necessity, right? There's so much that we do during the academic year, and we cram so much information into, those 10 months or so. It's really a good time for a student to, I think, let their hair down a little bit, right? And relax a little bit and think about what comes next and spend some time doing that, especially during, the summer between junior and senior year, when, as we know, Common Application opens up, August, and students are perhaps, getting ready to prepare for that, process. I think they need to take a deep breath and take a little, relax a little bit. And I think that's okay. Having worked in competitive admission almost my entire career, I would never say I remember or really can point to one summer activity that a student did that was, again, so sort of overwhelming that it made me want to admit them, right? I think it's, again, that full package, right? We talk about all the things holistically that a student does, and it's a combination of those things. There, you know, as a young person, you should enjoy, you know, your youthful summer and really think about what that means for yourself. For some students, that might mean a summer program, might mean living in a college, you know, residence hall so that they understand what it's like to live away and become independent and get to know people from across the country and be away from their parents if they haven't done that. And for other students, it means kicking their heels off on a nice vacation with their family because they haven't been able to do that since the previous summer, right? And they need that to rejuvenate and think about, you know, their next energy level for, you know, for entering into senior year.
I'd be remiss if I didn't say too, just quickly, Danielle mentioned earlier about that starting early. You can also visit us if you want to get started on some of your college visits. You know, it's definitely an opportunity. Maybe you do have some more availability, but also the summertime's nice because, as both Lowell and Danielle had mentioned, it is a little bit more low key. You know, summer tours are definitely, you know, definitely a bit lower in terms of just coming to the campus, getting a walkthrough with an ambassador, and just kind of seeing it at your own pace. So definitely an opportunity to maybe check out some of those and start building your list. And that will really alleviate, as they were saying, some of that stress that does come back in the fall when you are starting those applications that open, you know, in August, right? You've already gotten an established list because you visited, and that's really helpful.
So as we talk about summer, I'm going to direct this one right to Lowell. He already knows what I'm going to say. So Lowell, Wake Forest opens their application in August. Welcome to the South. I know that. However, we are in New Jersey, as you know, and we don't go back to school till after Labor Day. So what's some advice that you have for our students that are anticipating applying to your university ED? How do they navigate that process since we don't, you know, before Labor Day, because we don't start till afterwards?
Right, there you go. So I have maybe a general bit of wisdom, which is that every school will handle it differently. I think August 1st is when largely Common App becomes available for the following cycle. So, but not every school has an early kind of process the way the Wake Forest does. But take the time, do the research, talk to your counselors, I would say in advance, possibly spring of your junior year, to get a sense of what that might look like. Now, the advice that I can offer specifically for Wake Forest is that you're not putting yourself at any sort of competitive advantage by applying early. I know that there are rumors out there. I know that the word on the street, word on the internet is very much that there's an advantage to applying as early as possible in our process. And I can basically tell you point blank, and we're recording this, right? Like this can go on the internet, we can record this. There's no advantage to applying earlier in our process. We treat applications the same regardless of when they arrive. I will actually anecdotally share that I think that students who apply super duper early may be putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage, actually. And I say that because their applications are more likely to contain mistakes and typos. But I also think that students who apply too early, so if you're not familiar, Wake Forest has what's called a rolling early decision 1 process, which means that we try and let students know within 8 weeks of after their application completes out. A student that submits their application very, very early on is actually going to lose the opportunity to submit a senior year update. And that can actually greatly strengthen an application. If you think of the curriculum at Ridgewood, a lot of times the AP courses are kind of condensed into senior year, right? And so that means that you won't have any AP grades. And if we need to see AP grades to see how you're doing academically, you're not going to get a good decision. Whereas if you wait a little bit, and I always recommend to students, wait until you're back in school. I know the temptation is there to get that decision in as early as possible, to get that application in as early as possible. You're not putting yourself in an advantage by doing that. at Wake Forest, wait until you're back in school. Wait until you can talk to your counselors. Wait until your teachers are back in the swing of things, that you can, you're not going to bother them over summer for a recommendation letter or something like that. I promise you're still going to have the exact same chance of getting in. We're going to have the exact same standards of our review. So take your time, think it through, be deliberate. Think of the people around you, and I promise you, even if you submit your application when you get back to school in the fall after Labor Day, you're still going to hear back before anyone else will.
Thank you. I really do appreciate that. You are right. The rumors are out there. I mean, we've already had those conversations, and I know you know. So everybody, you're hearing it direct from Lowell. That's his advice. So we're gonna, and it is recorded. So we can quote you on it. But we do appreciate. I think that should alleviate a lot of the questions that are coming our way. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, so next question for all of you, and you can kind of speak generally on this. What is the advantage of an honors college, an honors program? Kind of touch upon those a little bit.
Sure. So I can speak just quickly to, the fact that Sacred Heart does have an honors college here at the university. Now, I will say that a lot of universities have different standards and also different processes for their honors colleges. For example, at Sacred Heart, you don't have to apply for our honors program. If you're admitted to the university, you will automatically be considered. Some colleges do actually have a separate application or a separate essay that you need to be considered. So just be aware of that if you are looking to go into it. There are definitely different benefits, again, pertaining to different honors programs. For, I guess you could say, tangible benefits for ours, students would receive an honors scholarship. They get priority housing as a freshman student. So there are things, again, some schools might have benefits that go along with it. But just in terms of the academic base, you're just with a different cohort of student, and a student that might be a bit more engaged, a bit more into critical thinking, and, professors that understand that their students are, in fact, engaged in their curriculum and in their studies. Not to say a non-honors student isn't, but I find that the students that are enrolled in the honors colleges typically have, a bit more academic rigor in their high school curriculum. And so they're able to come to their university and be a bit more engaged with their professors in that sense. And so certainly something that I would encourage everybody to consider. Again, every university has a different process with it, but you can certainly, utilize the strength that you've shown in high school to make yourself a potential candidate for an honors college at your school of interest.
I think another thing about an honors college, specifically because at most institutions, they are quite competitive. So it is a smaller applicant pool and a smaller admit pool. It's a great place to make a big place like an SDSU smaller. For sure. It comes with many perks, as Trevor mentioned, which might include living and learning communities, so residential communities. Perhaps there's a monetary value or a monetary link. But I think generally speaking, right, students that are looking at an honors program are usually looking at pretty intensive reading, writing, discussion-based small environments where they really thrive best, right? And knowing your learning style, you'd have to ask yourself that question. But if you're comfortable in a small environment, maybe around a big around a small round table, or in a smaller environment, it could be a good way for you to make larger classes smaller, and obviously to build relationships. I think it also would help for a student who might be financially looking at an institution that might be less competitive, less expensive, right? All of those things that we think of in our process, more competitive for themselves, right? So when you're thinking about applying to institutions where the overall admit rate might be slightly higher, but you have interest in that institution, it could also be another way of challenging yourself once you're enrolled at that institution, for numerous reasons. Also, along with, admission to an honors program usually comes another level of advising and mentorship, another community, right, for you to sort of think about building relationships. So I think the impactfulness is really strong with an honors curriculum. But unlike, some institutions that will invite you to an honors program, some institutions like the ones that I have worked for previously, all will ask you to apply. So just be sure that you're meeting deadlines, you're using the application when it's appropriate, you're perhaps thinking about the writing sample or a letter of recommendation that might be a requirement. Again, at institutions that I have worked for, both present and past, there is no monetary link. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't be a student who perhaps could be receiving a merit award, right, based on the fact that you may be a strong candidate academically, but sometimes there's no automatic sort of trophy, in the process. So just asking all of those questions is really important in terms of the honors, selection. And of course, you'll graduate with an honors diploma, right, which is wonderful. So another added bonus, to your experience as an undergraduate student.
Thank you. So this has been a little bit of a hot topic in our community lately, but so merit scholarships. So how do your schools determine merit scholarships? And also with that, with as we are in the test optional world, if students are not sending test scores, how does that work in the merit scholarship calculations, against students who are sending test scores? We'd love to have a little insight on that.
So at Wake, it's actually pretty easy. For the vast majority of our merit scholarships, your college application doubles as your merit scholarship application. We have tried to streamline this process as best that we can. We do have, I would say, one exception to that, very notably, our performing arts scholarships. If we're judging you based on your music talent, we actually need to hear you sing or play an instrument, right? And that requires an additional portfolio. But for most of our merit scholarships, if you get your college application in, early decision, regular decision, doesn't matter, by November 15th, you're automatically going to be considered for all of our merit awards. To kind of hit the second point, Wake is a test optional school. We have been a test optional school for 15 years. Test optional, you're starting to see more and more schools follow the lead. I think MIT was the first school, but other schools are kind of going back to being test required in future cycles. That is even more important for you to do your research and to talk to your counselors so that you know what might be expected of you if you're applying to school X, Y, or Z, because it is not going to be as uniformly one way or another as it has been in the past. At Wake, we have been test optional. We are very firm believers in test optional. We have full scholarship students who are completely test optional. We are accustomed to reading applications without seeing those scores, and we feel like we can make full scholarship evaluations without knowing what your test scores are. We feel perfectly okay with that, and we're committed to that test optional policy.
So for Sacred Heart specifically, actually, it's very similar to what Lowell had mentioned. So again, there is no separate application for us to be considered for a merit scholarship. If you're admitted to the university, you will automatically be considered for us. It's a cumulative GPA based. So students in high school that achieve higher cumulative GPAs are eligible for higher merit scholarships. And again, test scores do not factor in for us as well. I actually have never really heard of another school that had a 15-year test optional policy like Sacred Heart. So I'm glad that, Wake Forest is another school that's right with us. That's for over 15 years now. That's great. The thing that I tell students, because I know, as Lowell mentioned, right, there's a lot of students that are sort of wondering, and a lot of schools that might be looking to go back into that test required policy, whether it's for all programs or maybe specific programs such as, say, engineering or nursing or something like that. At least the evaluation process that we do here at Sacred Heart, what I tell students is that if you feel that your test is a good representation of who you are as a student, then send it. But if you do not feel like your test score represents who you are academically, if you just had, say, a bad 3 hours taking the SAT or the ACT that Saturday morning, or if you're just maybe not the best test taker, but really do well in school, at least for us, we don't feel like that should hinder your admission process with our university. And to be frank, most of our applicants do not submit test scores at Sacred Heart. About 70% of applicants don't have a test score. So it is in no way required here at the university, but I do agree with what Lowell had mentioned in saying, be aware of the schools that you are looking at, because there could be certain schools or certain programs within schools or certain scholarship opportunities, to kind of answer that first question too, that might be in addition to a merit scholarship that would require you to submit test scores. You could be considered for something, but in order to be eligible for XYZ scholarship, you will need to submit a test score to that school. So just make sure that you're aware as to what might be required for you to be considered for certain scholarships within the universities, whether it's test score, performing arts portfolio for a scholarship such as that, or anything else.
So fortunately, as a large public institution, we have a fairly competitive price tag. But unfortunately, we are also not generous, right? And we're very transparent and direct about that. So we do not allow for students to, we don't package students for merit, any type of merit. So when I say merit, right, I mean academic merit, money that would offset the cost based on talent, geography, major, leadership qualities, etc., until a student actually deposits and is attending SDSU. So it's a very, very unique process. It is not a process that is used by many universities, so I'll put that out there. But our Aztec scholarship portal is only, it is only available to students once they make a deposit. So the merit award, let's call it merit for now, is not a decision-making factor to attend SDSU, right? It's a nice perk if afterward you are, of course, rewarded with an award, free money that offsets the cost of attendance, but you will not know that when you make a deposit to the university. So this is something that's quite unique and will not change. So I want to put that out there. If you're going to put together a lengthy email, which is so well written and talks about all the awards that you've gotten from other institutions and can we help and offsetting your cost, my answer is usually 3 lines long, which unfortunately ends in I'm sorry in some way, because obviously we ask students and their families to have conversation about our bottom line cost of attendance in terms of the tuition, fees, room and board when they do make a decision to attend, because again, fees are very much allocated for each student as an out-of-state attendee.
I'll follow up on that, and I think Danielle raised a great point here. We talk about jargon and we talk about this. It can be a little bit different for lay people in terms of terminology and what we're going through. Sit down, have these conversations with your counselors. It is important to note that most schools will delineate somewhat between need-based financial aid and merit aid, as Danielle kind of said. And sometimes there's like a wild variation between what you're going to get from a certain school. Like some schools allocate a lot more of their resources towards need-based financial aid. Some schools allocate more of their resources towards the merit-based side. Do your due diligence for the need-based financial aid side. Even with the challenges to FAFSA, every school is required to have a net price calculator available for you to be able to explore kind of the need-based financial components. That will not apply to all of you, but it will probably apply to some of you. If merit scholarships are going to be a consideration for you as you navigate the process, do your research on the schools, because there are some schools that offer a lot of merit-based aid, not need-based financial aid, but merit-based aid, and some schools that do not. And so if that's going to be something that is going to be a major part of your search, that should impact some of your search criteria for the schools that you're looking for.
And in different pools and at different times of the year, right? So if you're applying early decision versus regular decision, et cetera, and that might have a bearing on, again, how schools offer aid and what types of aid are available between those pools.
Great, thank you so much. And throughout your answers, you talk a lot about testing. And so if this is a little bit redundant, just bear with me. But students are still struggling with the test optional concept, right? They honestly believe that you're still, if I don't submit, that means I did poorly. And so we guide them through that. But have you seen a difference in terms of students that do submit and students that are, honor the test optional policies that you have in place? Are you seeing a different quality of student? Do you see a different, their level of involvement in things? Are you seeing any difference?
Can I tell a story? Trevor, you go first. I'll tell a story afterwards.
I was going to say, I'll only go for about 30 seconds. I'll just say that not necessarily, not really. I mean, we've had students that, again, have had 4.0 GPAs, but have been sub 1,000 super scores on an SAT. And we've had students that have been, maybe 3.2, 3.3 GPAs with 1,500 SATs. And so it's varied. The variance is high, both in terms of GPA to SAT, ACT correlation. And that sort of leads back to my first point I made, in which if you feel like it represents you academically, send it to schools that require or are optional. But if you don't, and the school's test optional, they're test optional. They're telling you.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, I've worked for institutions that were test required, then were test required, went through the test optional process for probably, again, about 15 years. I'm at an institution that's test blind. We don't use testing at all in our process. There's no option. You don't have the option to think about how it reflects your academic record and send it or withhold it. We don't look at it. So I think, you know, that this phenomenon of testing and how it sort of reflects, you know, who you are in the process. You probably spend too much time thinking about it, and we spend a lot less time, I think, you know, thinking about the review. But I would say that if you are at an, you know, in a senior, rising senior, and your need to obviously think about this comes sooner than later, I would encourage you, right, to talk to your counselor, to think about your option. It is an option. If it's an option for you, right, it's one of the control factors in this process. And so I always say to my students, control the things that you can, right, and dismiss the things that you can't. And one of the things that you have control over, we just talked about a few minutes ago, who you ask for a letter of recommendation, when you ask for that letter of recommendation, should you submit testing, what types of testing, et cetera, right? So this is another control factor and another piece of the puzzle that you have the ability, you know, to control. And I think with testing, right, we just like the essay, we spend too much time, you know, thinking about it than perhaps writing it. But I think in terms of the testing piece, it should reflect who you are as the academic student. And that's the bottom line, I think, that, you know, Trevor's trying to drill home. If you find that the testing, if you're at the very top of your class and your testing is not in the top quartile or the top percentage, then maybe it doesn't reflect how hard you're working on a daily basis, right, in your classroom, in your academic coursework, you know, across the board at Ridgewood High School. So maybe you withhold it. Your testing is probably still very strong. It just perhaps is not as strong as the reflected academic GPA that we see on your transcript. So it might be in our profile, you might be in the 50th percentile, but perhaps your grades are in the top 5% of your class. And so you're withholding it, right? So it's the balance of those things, right? It's the combination of those two things that don't make sense. And that's why you're withholding it, right? Not that we think that you have weak scores or that you didn't pay attention or that you didn't spend enough time studying or you weren't awake during the test, you know, et cetera. It's really that the two things, right, don't make sense in combination. And I think that's really why we're encouraging you when we talk about things being optional, right, that you do your research to determine, of course, if it's the best opportunity for you to include or exclude the testing.
Here to everything that Danielle just said. I will reiterate that so hard. If it's think about your application strategically, and regardless of what the score is, if it's a strong data point, submit it. If it's a weaker data point, don't. You want to showcase the things that you're most proud of in this process. Wake has been test optional for 15 years. We've been able to do 10 graduating classes worth of survey data. Statistically speaking, you are more likely to graduate with a higher Wake Forest GPA if you're the captain of a sports team in high school than if you have above 1,500 SAT. Those scores have very little predictive value. Now, as for the story, so we had a student probably around 8 years ago who applied, local student down here in North Carolina. She applied test optional. She was top of the class at her high school, did some really cool things. She was a very talented dancer, and she ended up applying for the dance scholarship. We admitted her early decision, and we were going to award her the dance scholarship. And somehow, when we were awarding her the dance scholarship, we were poking around in her materials, and someone saw the SAT score. And this is why I tell this, because this is a cautionary tale. Her SAT score was very, very low, well below our standards. And not only are we admitting this student, we're giving her a scholarship. And so that prompted some major hand-wringing on our part, until one of my colleagues pointed out, no, actually, this doesn't matter, because look when she took the test. She took it in the 7th grade as part of the Duke TIP initiative and never retook it. because she knew she was going to apply to a test optional school. And so she literally had never taken it after the 7th grade. And it did not matter at all. She ended up graduating with Wake Forest with a very, very high GPA. She was an absolute rock star on campus. But people make assumptions based on that score. And even people in our profession who are trained to ignore or to contextualize that score, we make assumptions based on that score. So if you are applying to test optional schools, think about whether you want to submit it. It can really, really hurt your application if you are submitting a low score. Please do not feel like you have to. What test optional ultimately means, we're saying that as schools, for our own philosophical reasons, it doesn't matter what they are, but for our own philosophical reasons, if you don't want that to be a part of your application, we are saying you don't have to have that in the application. It is not going to count against you. There's never a stigma against you if you choose not to submit that score. We will literally just move on to the rest of the application and look at everything else that you do submit. Okay?
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's very important for everyone to hear. All right, we've made it to our last question. So high schools, New Jersey in our area, we haven't used class rank in decades. So we're wondering, how do you assess academic achievement without knowing if a student is number 10 in the class, number 50 towards the end? What piece of information is most valuable when you're determining the strength of an applicant in their application?
So, when we're looking at students' applications, we do take what we call a holistic approach. So we are evaluating every part of that student's application. Now, in many cases, Sacred Heart and a lot of institutions, right, the academics do hold significant, and if not, the most weight, right? We need to see if a student is academically admissible. We all just sort of went through and discussed how we're all test optional or test blind institutions. And so looking at other aspects then for academics, what are we looking for? And not having rank as a data point really isn't an issue for us, right? So, when we're evaluating a student's transcript, we're looking at their whole body of work. So not just what they have currently for a senior class schedule, but what their rigor they had taken as a freshman year going forward. And in a lot of cases, there are students that perhaps had struggled. I know that this group of seniors, their fully online COVID year was their freshman year. And so we did see, a lot of students that had issue during that freshman year with just being fully remote and fully online. And we saw significant improvement for them in their sophomore and junior years going forward. And so, we're not having a class rank isn't a deterrent for us when we're evaluating. I'd have to really look, but I would say that the majority of schools that I look at don't have a class rank at all. And so it's not just a Ridgewood High School thing. It's a lot of schools that I'm looking at, and it doesn't really factor into us too much because we are taking the holistic approach. Again, we're looking at your transcript and your grades there, but we are looking so much at what you're doing outside of the classroom as well as a factor.
I probably will be so bold as to say that if you are still producing a class rank, you're doing your class a disservice as a high school. And I believe there might be maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 schools in New Jersey that might still offer ranking, maybe a few more in terms of the decile or quartile. But I think given that students' grade point averages are separated by 0.00001, one percentage, there really doesn't make sense, right, in terms of a rank. And what we're looking at is not a number. What we're looking at is how the student obviously progresses. Where does the student start? How does the student end? How does the student appropriately, so let me stress this again, appropriately challenge themselves, not taking every single advanced course and then struggling, but taking courses that they're going to do well in and enjoy, and obviously, right, challenge themselves. We're looking at how students become involved, leaders on their campuses, in their communities. We're looking at so much information, right, in this, holistic process, even if processes like mine are a little more transparent and direct. First, we're looking at a school's high school profile, right? I mean, most of us are traveling what we call regionally, right? We, whether we're regionally based like I am, or obviously like Lowell and Trevor, who spend the majority of their time in New Jersey, meeting with counselors, meeting with high school students, building relationships with families so that we understand, right, the nuances of the education that the student's receiving. So a lot of us first will look at the school itself as an institution. The high school profile sets the tone for that, right? So when the application is processed, the counseling offices are usually sending out the high school profile. I refer to that as my holy grail, right? I can take a look at that to see not only what the staff, who the staff is, and if I need to make contact. I don't need to in this case, because you guys know I bombard you with emails. But in some cases, right, I might need to reach out. I might need to ask for clarification. I might not understand the grading scale, how many AP courses are offered, how the student moves into an AP, right? All that information is provided by a high school profile, which is why it's really important, to get to know it so that we can see apple to apple, right? What does the student have at their own high school? What are the advantages? What are the opportunities? And then we can look at the transcript and say, what is the student taking advantage of in relationship to those opportunities, and how are they doing so? So I would say that in terms of the rank, right, we're not so much concerned, again, just like a GPA, we generally will all recalculate the GPA to our scale, whatever that means for us. And I try to encourage families to remember that it doesn't matter if they don't know how we do it or they don't understand how we do it, right? We're all sort of pulling apart the academic transcript in a different way, but we're all looking at the academic coursework, the level of rigor of those courses, the grading, associated with those courses, the trend in the grades. Some of us might be looking at additional information, the major the student's applying to, the college of their choice, certain academic curriculum within that high school, record. If we're applying to engineering, right, we might be looking more strongly at the math and science curriculum, or overall at the writing curriculum for an honors, position. So we're really pulling apart that academic transcript, and we're doing it in different ways to look at all of the information that's included to make a good decision. So I've worked with students that have 4.0 GPAs, 100 GPAs, 12-point scales, and no grading, right? I mean, there's some of the most reputable high schools in the country that have no grading scales, just an hour north of us from Ridgewood. So you use your high school profile and you use your guidance staff, right? Your school counseling staff, your guidance that you receive from them in terms of making good decisions for students based on the information that you have, apple to apple, depending on who the high school is.
I'll just follow up to say, this is a non-insignificant part of our jobs as regional representatives, is to know the context of each and every school. And if we have questions about that, then we're going to reach out to your counseling staff. And so we are not shy about reading the profile, getting to know the school, the specialty programs, the allied health program, the American Studies program that Ridgewood has, things like that. We know those minutia in the curricula at each and every school. That's our job. And if there's something that's new, we're going to learn about it and be able to kind of contextualize it so that we can make that apples to apples comparison for every single student.
Thank you. I heard someone the other day in a webinar, it was an admissions representative from a particular college, and they said they have 4,500 different transcripts in different high schools that they have to sift through. So, it's quite remarkable what you guys do. Just so our community knows, for those who aren't aware, we do update our school profile every single summer. So you'll see ours for last year's classes available on our website. I have a book on my desk. We have profiles back to the 1960s. It's pretty interesting to look back throughout the years when we used to rank and do different things. So it's always changing. We try to update it every single year because our curriculum is updating, our classes are updating, our profiles are changing. So that is something that is constantly updated. We're going to let you all go here. I just have two kind of rapid fire questions that come up quite a bit. Do you take into account for admission junior year AP scores. So if a student takes AP tests and submits scores, yay or nay, does that, you consider that for admission? No from Trevor, no from Danielle.
If a student wants us to see them, then sure.
Okay.
We're happy to have anything like that. Again, test optional, so it's optional. It's not something you have to submit. But if if it's something you're proud of, heck yeah, toot your own horn.
Okay.
You earned it.
This is more of my things. I'm always puzzled by this, and it does kind of create a stir in our community and other schools. You just said high schools don't rank anymore. It actually hurts them a lot. Even don't, we used to even do decile ranking, and now we just do a GPA calculation.
No, I don't miss that prep GPA and all that, Bailey.
Yeah, yeah. We made it easier for you. We made it nice and easy for you. So why then do students, parents, counselors, all of us see like all these colleges brag about, well, we had 80% of our incoming freshman class were in the top 10% of their high school. How do they know this? It's causing so much distress on our end.
Okay.
But what is there like a wink there? Is it just, how are they getting that data, and how is it accurate?
I'll fall on this sword. So I assume everyone here is familiar with the U.S. News and World Report, that list of college rankings. So one of the criteria that historically went into that ranking was the percentage of students enrolled at a college that are in the top 10% of their graduating class. That, I would say, is obviously every school wants to say we're having great students, we have strong students, we're increasing our academic profile and things. But the reality of the situation is that we had to care because that ranking said we had to care. That ranking has actually gone away with that part of the rankings moving forward. So they changed the methodology this year. And part of the change in that methodology was that they took out that component. Schools are still going to track it because we're tracking it for our own kind of internal data. We're tracking it because we want to, to our alumni, yes, your degree is appreciating in value. The way that we get that data, I think, will depend from school to school, but most of the schools, we talked about schools in New Jersey not having exact rank, but there are other school systems out there that do still publish exact rank. And so we are relying very heavily on those to create that data. It is a disservice to students because it creates an arbitrary have-not kind of situation. A student that is ranked 30th out of 300 is a yes, and a student that's ranked 31st out of 300 is a no, just based on that demarcation, and it's ridiculous. But that's kind of what the industry kind of forces us to do. I think you'll see, hopefully, moving forward with the U.S. News and World Report kind of changes to the ranking, that schools will care a lot less about that. We'll still care because we're still trying to enroll as strong a class as we can. But we won't have to report that data, and our professional kind of schools won't be kind of judged collectively on what that data says that our school is. And so you may see a more relaxed version of it. That is not something that you have to work with, because schools that don't rank, we don't have to report that data. So it doesn't apply to Ridgewood.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, was, so New Jersey schools are really not included in that statistic then? So it's just schools who report exact ranking or a decile ranking that you would put in that data. Okay, so I mean,
that is how we have interpreted that data.
Okay.
So other schools may do it differently, but
I guess my final question on that would be, because I'm thinking of questions that I would ask if I were a parent listening. Does that put Ridgewood High School at a disadvantage because Wake Forest can't brag about how many kids may be in their top 10% in Ridgewood High School that you admit?
It's all good. We know the quality of school. When we talk about quality of the admitted student, we know that not every school has the same quality of student, and some schools are stronger than others. So in many cases, a student who would be second or third decile at a place like Ridgewood might be better than a top 10% student elsewhere. So
understood. And we've went back into the history of the ranking here, and just so the community knows, like, we were one of the first schools in Bergen County to get rid of rank in the late 90s, actually. And like Danielle said, we just feel very strongly that, if we ranked, it might help 4 or 5 kids in our class, but it's going to hurt 425 kids in our opinion. So That's our rationale. I've talked to parents, I've talked to community members about it, and I'm happy to always have that discussion if you want to sit down and just kind of talk about our philosophy about it. But we try to make the decisions that we think are best for all of our kids and their mental well-being. I don't love them walking our halls with, different numbers attached to them. Like I'm number 321 or I'm 129, or I don't think that's good for our young people. So thank you guys. We've already kind of gone above and beyond here. So I want to be respectful of your time and thank you for the conversation tonight. Really learned a lot. Again, we will share this out with the community. Thank you for all you do for our students and for us too. It was a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
All right.
Thank you,
Good
guys.
night, everyone.
I put my contact information chat if people.
Oh, great. Yeah. If you want to leave that for the parents, your email information, any follow-ups. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.